the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes, Nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of A Little Bit Culty. Our guest today is Anke Richter. Anke like Danke. Anke Richter, a New Zealand-based author of Cult Trip, Inside the World of Coercion and Control from HarperCollins 2022, which, by the way, is finally out as an audiobook and just had its U.S. paperback release in February 2024.
Cult Trip covers Anke's intrepid and conflicting journey as a journalist researching the disastrous aftermath of a former sex cult, while also being sucked into the conscious sexuality school, ISTA, that has now come under scrutiny.
Reading her book brought some cults onto our radar that were totally new and horrifying to us. So we're excited for the chance to chat with her. We'll talk about the culty AF Centrepoint commune, the Gloriavale Christian community, and her trip through New Zealand's major cultiness overall. FYI, New Zealand, you're a culty place. You okay? Should we come visit?
Anke's book has led to work as a media liaison and advocate for cult survivors and collaborations with international cult experts, survivor networks, therapists, and counselors. Her latest project is organizing New Zealand's first cult symposium, TEDx style, for late 2024 in Christchurch. Her story spans journalism, a personal entanglement with a controversial organization, and advocacy work. A lot to cover there.
So let's get to it. Here's our chat with Anke Richter. And please be advised, listener, the cults we discuss in this episode involve terrible abuses of power. So we'll be covering things like sexual assault, also assault of children. So please listen with care. Thank you. Welcome to A Little Bit Culty.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. You have no idea. This is it for me. After a year of my book out and podcasting and whatnot, but here we are. Fantastic.
Great.
I am so happy to finally have you on, and we have both been just devouring your book.
Cruise through it.
Yeah, we're going to talk all about it. And you brought a bunch of groups or cults, depending on your perspective, to our purview, which we didn't know, right? We didn't know about. So thank you for that. And how you feeling?
A bit nervous and also aware that you guys have not heard of these groups that here in my neck of the woods, everyone's very, very familiar with. And
I bet.
We've got court cases here. We've got historical abuse that's been discussed now and then over the last decades. And you're hearing all this for the first time. So I'm also curious how it landed for you.
Well, first of all, there's something with the towns of Albany. Because we were in Albany, New York, and you're Albany, Auckland.
And said for Centrepoint, right?
It's a bit conspiratorial.
Yeah. No, I'm doing it. And
putting the dots together here.
And there is an Albany in Georgia. There's an Albany in Georgia, but I'm afraid to drive through it now. So,
well, let's check out what's happening there. Yeah.
So we just loved your book. For those who don't know your story, give us a little bit of introduction. What was the genesis of Cult Trip inside the world of coercion and control? Where did your journey start?
Well, this book is almost like a miracle baby after a termination, because there was another book that I failed to finish, which was the book about Centrepoint, the first cult in the book, which was a former sex and therapy cult here in New Zealand. Well, my journey with it all really started about 10 years ago. I mean, I've been always interested in communities, and I wouldn't just say cults, but I spent a year at a Rudolf Steiner boarding school in England when I was 16. I think that was really formative, stepping out of the sort of German mainstream of a very sort of high achiever family and education and all of that, and being in such a different environment. Then I spent more than half a year as a doctor's wife on a remote atoll in the South Pacific in a very small Polynesian community. All these things had a profound impact on me. And I've always been drawn to alternative festivals here in New Zealand. There's some really beautiful intentional communities that are not cultic, but I mean, you never know where things can go, of course, in this country. So I was a woofer in my 30s when I stepped away from television for a year and did a sabbatical and traveled around Australia and was a willing worker on organic farms. So really was always seeking out those contrasts, I guess, to my home life or to my career. And so I've been drawn into those directions anyway. Like what do people do who want to live differently from the mainstream, or what are they exploring, or what do they have to offer for me? So 10 years ago, I went to 12 years ago, I went to a Neo-Tantra festival in Australia. And I was really curious about it. I was a little bit cynical about it too, but I went there with some friends that already sort of started to dabble a little bit in this scene for personal reasons, had my apprehensions, but then I jumped on the opportunity to go to this festival. And also I was also later asked to write a little sort of, nothing investigative, just like an experiential piece about it, which I wrote under pseudonym because I would have never really owned to the fact that this could also be something for me that I really liked. And so I was there, and it was, incidentally, this is also where I got hooked into the whole, I would say, conscious sexuality scene, or whatever you want to call it, while it was also my unintentional entry into cult journalism, because I met a woman there from this former New Zealand sex cult, Centrepoint, and she had been a teenager there. The commune concubine, as she described it. And that opened up a whole world for me. I thought, actually, with my journalist hat on, this is a book. I've written 3 books previously, published in Germany. I thought, this is a massive story. I should write it down. I've got I have someone here who wants to share a story, and but there's more. And yes, there was more. There was too much more. I spent 2 years mired in this labyrinth of former cult victims' stories and trauma that hadn't really been processed. And in the end, I had to give up that book after 2 years when the going got too hard, and it was a massive, massive failure for me. But it was also the starting point then for more investigations and looking into other groups, culture groups, and actually becoming more. I got my own cult education through all this research, and then I was better set up to look into other groups as well. And then, full circle, HarperCollins came around and offered me to write a book about cults in New Zealand and maybe a bit further. And I said, well, it so happens that I have an unfinished manuscript in my drawer, my computer, of a book that I had to give up on the first round. And this is how all this came about. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so many questions, but there's 2 things I just need you. Well, one thing I need you to define first of all, because you said that you got into this through the neo-tantric scene or conscious sexuality. Can you just give our listeners a little bit of background on what those terms mean?
Yeah. Normally people call it just Tantra, and I prefer to call it Neo-Tantra because Tantra, from my limited understanding, I'm really not a scholar or expert on any of this, just a former participant, but Tantra is an ancient tradition, comes from Hinduism and Buddhism, whereas Neo-Tantra is a often culturally appropriated Western version that was sprung mainly from Osho or Bhagwan or Rajneesh ashram in Pune, but also Aleister Crowley's sex magic in San Francisco, and a lot of the 70s groups in California who were propagating a mix of New Age therapies, human potential movement stuff, and a lot of that stuff's not wrong. I wouldn't just put it all under this umbrella of toxic tantra, as I put it in my book. But I think there's a whole movement now over the last decades, also of sexual educators, of healers, of body-focused therapists, who are also trying to really offer some work where maybe gynecologists and psychotherapists can't go. So there's good stuff and there's bad stuff in there. As in all those things.
It's messy, as we call it.
Yeah,
I'd say the 70s California movements have produced quite a few episodes for us. That time frame is really...
They've got a lot to answer for. That's right. We're still seeing the roll-on effect of it, yeah.
Well, I feel like all the cults and communities that you cover in your book deserve their own podcast eventually, their own episode with survivors. And I feel like this is a great entry point for our audience to understand what you went through and what you uncovered and what you unearthed. I personally didn't, I mean, like I said, the cults, people had mentioned them to me. I'd heard of Centrepoint, I've heard of Gloriavale, but I had Gloriavale? Gloriavale, yeah.
Or Gloriavale.
Gloriavale, let's call it that. Yeah, I'd heard of them.
We've been getting pinged about it a lot.
I did, but I hadn't deep dived. Yeah. But one thing I also didn't know is just that there were conscious communities in New Zealand, that there was an influx of people trying to, build something different and also get out of Western civilization's belief system and create something unique, separate of the cults, correct?
Yeah, it's interesting because New Zealand's had the highest number of intentional communities in the world. I'm not sure if they still all exist, but definitely in the 80s, it became such a magnet for people to, escape from, Europe, with Chernobyl and the Cold War and whatnot. It became this utopian place. Actually, it's always been a utopian place, even after the Second World War, with, refugees and Holocaust survivors. And it's always been this sort of haven for new beginnings. And surprise, has also been a haven for some cult leaders who wanted to set up shop here, like Swami, the still, running head of Agama Yoga from Thailand. He checked out New Zealand to see if he could bring his flock here and build some, doomsday getaway bunker thing or whatever on a mountain. And he's not the only one. It's a place where often people come and think they can just sort of hide from authorities in other countries. So I think we need to be especially aware of cults here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I had no idea. And I also excited about this episode because, as you know, and you even mentioned NXIVM for a second in your book, being a sex cult. That's something I've always explained as like, well, there was the program and then there was the stuff behind closed doors. All of these programs were specifically about sexual exploration and liberation. That was part of the education, right?
Yeah. In my book, I made it really clear that I said how misrepresenting the term sex cult is, also especially for NXIVM, and that maybe sex trafficking cult would be the more correct way of putting it, because people like yourself, obviously, and most people didn't go in it for sexual exploration. They were there for different reasons. Right. And I guess that's different to cults where sex is left front and center, but then it can be more hidden or more veiled. Even Gloriavale, this extreme fundamentalist Christian cult here in New Zealand that's so on the radar at the moment because they have lots of court cases. Some of their sexual abusers are finally been brought to justice just of this week. A big conviction, slave labor cases, whatnot. I mean, and they look like, the Handmaid's Tale come to life in blue, not in red. And they all wear these long frocks, and even just showing a bit of your skin on your ankle is a transgression and so on. But they're also a highly sexualized group on the inside and have far more in common with Centrepoint, the former sex cult, than you would think, because there's such a focus on not just on multiplying and breeding, as in a lot of Christian cults, as a form basically of growing, but also of subjugating women because they're constantly in that role and constantly breeding. But also there's such a focus on the quote unquote marital life and marital education. And that was often demonstrated in a very abusive way, to the point of the former late leader even raping a young woman with a wooden dildo, things like that. It's very normalized in there, of course, to see your parents having sex because everyone sleeps in the same room, or it's talked about at dinner time about what the cows do, and then this is how we should do it. And it's become such a, and the psychic split between having such an enforced purity culture, while on the other hand, you're having this over-sexualized frame, but you can only move in it in the terms that have been dictated to you with obviously not as a queer person, obviously not with a partner of your choice, only in those confines of what the cult dictates, but then it's all on. Gosh, I mean, can you imagine what that does to people, and especially young people,
especially
and children
kids
who've grown up in there? So they qualify as a sex cult in my books too, right?
Yes.
Even though that's not what people in New Zealand think of them.
Absolutely. Well, we saw so many parallels between, even though the cults were new, it was still fairly textbook, right? In terms of the patterns of behavior and
the process is identical.
Identical.
I guess when Centrepoint, we can get more into Centrepoint too, but Centrepoint puts the con right out front, whereas Keith put the con through personal and professional development, right?
Well, I guess it's not so much the con that he put the teachings
well, that's what
up
he
front.
Used.
He put the teaching up front.
Yeah, he used the teaching to lure, but for bait and switch.
I meant Centrepoint put the sex education.
Yes,
you're
that's
coming
why
there
you came.
For the sexual liberation.
Right, but not really.
Right?
You're coming there for the sexual liberation, but it was also a quote-unquote therapy cult.
Right.
They offered therapy workshops. They were all self-appointed therapists. And a lot of Auckland's psychologists and psychotherapists from the university, in their established professions, flocked there on weekends, did courses. They wouldn't be seen dead now, but no one wants to admit that they were all participating there for some time. And then Bert Potter, the leader there, was there, he was the to-go-to guy at the time, especially when it came to unblocking women, because New Zealand, I mean, we're talking early 80s. It wasn't California. Yeah. It wasn't Berlin. It was a real backwater when it comes to therapy or liberation. And people come out of restrictive Christianity usually, and there was no counseling around. There were the churches and maybe your doctor, your family doctor, and that was it. And then Bert Potter became the to-go-to guy to quote unquote unblock women and help them. So there was a real need for these kind of services, but where they went and who they engaged with about this obviously was the wrong person. But the overall thing was always therapy, liberation. They didn't put sex they didn't promote that on the outside so much, but it became known for it, and it became known as a place where people open up their relationships and they explore. And of course, if you're on the inside, the pressure to do that was huge. And then word got also out that this is a place, word got out too late and wasn't acted on, that children weren't safe there and children were involved in these, in these sexual activities, and children were being preyed on and so on. And I guess that also maybe made it a magnet for some people further down the track as well, where I thought, oh, we can just blend in here as pedophiles, and then we're gonna, it's kind of accepted what we're after. So that was all enmeshed, the therapy and the fake sexual liberation, because it wasn't liberation. People there weren't free. Oh, you're familiar with polyamory. It's been a big buzz over the last decade or so. And this wasn't polyamory. This wasn't about really respecting each other's boundaries and having good communication and being equal players on an equal field. Otherwise, if there's coercion, there's no freedom. So all the talk about the free love community, there was no real love. And there wasn't really real freedom. So I'm a bit allergic to that being the, if the word polyamory gets mixed in with those kind of groups, because that's not what it was. It was enforced promiscuity, and it's done so much damage.
Well, because you couldn't say no, right? And any personal boundary was a sign of something to be unblocked.
Exactly. It was a sign of weakness or not being, you need to get with the program. And the terrible thing was not just for the adults, it caused a lot of harm there too, but imagine being a 12, 13-year-old in that environment where you, in order to sort of survive and have your have your place in the pecking order and run with the pack, you would have to be that young sort of goddess, flirty, commune concubine, as my interview and friend Angie Micklejohn, who I met at that festival, explained it to me. It was a modus operandi, and for those who didn't quite understand where all this was coming from, especially maybe men of a certain age who were in this community, entered the community, they saw these frisky young girls approaching them and asking for a quickie in the bushes and whatnot. And they thought, okay, well, they want this. This is consensual. And then they were all absolutely astonished that later on this was framed as abusive because, hey, everyone wanted this. Most people did not understand who lived in there or who came there and participated in workshops, that what they were seeing was coercive control, and people didn't really act from their own will. They were in survival mode.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/a-little-bit-culty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one.
If anyone hasn't done the work that you've done or read your whole book or been on this decade-long journey, how do you respond to them? What's the antidote to that belief? They said they were into it. This is what they signed up for. What's your explanation to that?
It's difficult because it takes me right back to those conflicting years where I was so deep in all the research, where I talked to all these people, some of these, some wonderful, smart, caring adults who explained it all to me, who had lived there as adults, who were concerned about what happened, but who didn't really grasp the full picture. And then later, sometimes I found out that they were also complicit in the abuse.
Right.
I was thrown around morally by so many perspectives, and I couldn't keep distance. So you asking me that now brings me back to, I almost lost my perspective on that, because at some point you almost wonder, what's the matrix here?
Yeah.
Right.
Who got it all wrong? Maybe they were on the path to some kind of utopian liberation, and if only, us people with our old hang-ups and frameworks from the mainstream hadn't interfered. I mean, I know this sounds completely ridiculous.
No, not at all.
No,
I did this as I was leaving. Anke, I did that. I was leaving next year. I'm maybe I'm wrong. Keith is really,
No, I had to tell her. Even she would say to me, she nippy did. I'm like, no, Sarah, they branded you. I had to really. I had to say that to her, right?
And I was still go, but what's bad about it? Because I was still gaslighting myself. So you were gaslighting.
Hold my beer, I'll tell you.
To unpick that and unpack that. And I wasn't even a victim of Centrepoint. I hadn't even been in there. I was only observing that and getting this vicarious trauma and taking it all on. And still I was thrown around by these experiences and these perspectives and what is right and wrong. And then, of course, they had some of these former adults, well-trained in the human potential and rhetoric and stuff. They had a real knack of getting to me straight away. So basically every interview I started with them, or every phone call started with, so why are you doing this? Have you been sexually abused yourself? Boom, they just sort of went right in there. Like, they always brought it back to me. Like, what's your agenda here? What's wrong with you that you want to even know what we did wrong, right? So something had to be wrong, right? Yep. Or damaged in me. Otherwise, I would just leave these wonderful people alone who did nothing wrong, and it was just the police and the social workers who turned it all around. And something was, when you hear that too often, it leaves something behind where you start questioning yourself. And as a journalist, I mean, I clearly wasn't a newbie. Now I've done 30 years of journalism. So back then, over 20 years, I was a hard-hitting showbiz reporter in my early years. I worked for a tabloid. I'm not a I'm not a shrinking flower when it comes to dealing with tough people on the other side of the phone or the other side of the interview. But because this became almost so personal, and I was so deeply invested because I'd met so many of the victims, and I wanted to do them justice and bring justice for them. And I was so lost in this labyrinth of different perspectives. So every bit that added to the self-doubt really landed for me. At some point, questioning myself, what am I doing? Am I just on a crusade here for some personal reason? Who am I trying to rescue? Is this even right? And usually as a journalist, you keep a distance. You go in there, you spend maybe a few days maximum, maybe a few weeks if it's a longer feature, with people, and then you pull back, and then you write your piece, and then you double check your quotes, and it can all be still very, very stressful and intense. But at some point, you step away from it.
It's wrapped up.
It gets wrapped up, but in my case, there just seemed to be no end. So I was lost, and this is a very long answer to your initial question, right? What was the question? Like, how do you find that perspective, right?
What do you say to people who say that they chose to be there and that they asked for it?
Kind of deny the abuse.
Well, yeah, to deny the abuse. They say it's not abuse because they were asking for it.
Well, first of all, the 12-year-olds, the 14-year-olds, the 15-year-olds, the kids at Centrepoint never choose to be there.
No.
That's the first thing. Secondly, these adults later on, and some of these mothers who saw their young daughters being taken away to Bert Potter's hut, and they knew what was happening there. And one woman had a breakdown on the lawn while other women basically told her, hey, you can't stop your child from being, you're such a blocked person now. Don't you want your child to do better than that? Don't deny your child this opportunity. And these women were also suffering. We can look at them and seeing, oh my God, they let their 12-year-olds be, deflowered, or whatever you want to call it, raped, by the guru. But also these women, they were also victims of control, and they paid a price for that, and they lost contact with their daughters later on. So did they choose this when they went in there in the first place? Was this what they thought they were signing up for when they joined Centrepoint in the late 70s or early 80s, sold all their belongings, lived in this wonderful community where everyone was working on the land? And it didn't say anywhere, we're here because we want our children one day to be sexually abused and pay a price for that for the rest of their life. That wasn't why they joined. So what do I say to people like that? I said, no one choose that. There are levels of control. There is a culture that you never, some people can feel it that something's off, but unless you really unpack it and you really understand what's going on and how it works, it's not so easy to just see why people seemingly play along and they play happy. Look, just to switch over to Gloriavale, because there's so many parallels. So Gloriavale's still going here in New Zealand. It's actually been going for 40, 50 years, which is actually shocking if you think of it.
Oh, yeah. Can you just explain what Gloriavale is before we...
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. And what the difference is?
Think of the most fundamentalist Mormon Christian evangelical cult in the US. Put them all in a remote compound, put them all in blue dresses, and that's Gloriavale. Yeah.
Okay. And Centrepoint?
Centrepoint existed only until 2000 for about 22 years. It was a sex and therapy cult and was in a different part of New Zealand, also a community, but people didn't dress uniform. They were probably more seen as middle-class hippies, really. And that was led also by a charismatic leader called Bert Potter, who actually, who's now dead, died at around the same time. I know, so not quite true, but he was operating at the same time as the leader of Gloriavale. They were actually, I've only learned this recently, they were actually watching each other really closely, like who's got the better game to pull people in, and because they were both, one openly and one more, the others more inside, propagating this sexual openness and how we can all free ourselves if we embrace our sexual urges more, and we practice that in a group and in workshops. So interesting that there was this competition.
You were making a parallel between Centrepoint and you said, brings me back to Gloria.
Yes, explaining Gloriavale, exactly, just for those who don't know. So it's this really extremist fundamentalist cult, and it's still operating here. 600 people, most of them are children these days. So, a majority of their women of their members are people who never had a choice. They have had a lot of people leave and escape, and people kicked out who've been really, really struggling when they come out here in New Zealand, like refugees in their own country. Finally, now they're getting good support from a victim advocacy group, and that's really amazing. But that hasn't happened until the last 10 years or so. So it's a massive problem in New Zealand also because we don't have the authorities to deal with this. And people here love to mock Gloriavale, make jokes about it. And part of the problem, and again, back to when people say, well, isn't this their choice? Well, we had a TV series here in New Zealand. I think it's actually done a lot of damage that portrayed Gloriavale. It was an observational documentary, flockumentary, mockumentary. It was called a documentary, but I don't really want to call it this as a journalist because it was just too uncritical. It came out about 8 years ago, and it just portrayed Gloriavale in this sort of saccharine light of, look at these interesting people in there. We're just an observational religious, program here, observing what they do and their wedding ceremonies and their this and their that. And it was a real fan following around Gloriavale. New Zealanders are obsessed with it. I went to the hairdressers yesterday for this interview. Hairdresser, voice of the people,
right?
Asked me what I do in my book and whatnot. Oh, Gloriavale, and so fascinated by it. And there's a folklore fascination with Gloriavale, and I think it really takes away from there are people and they're suffering. This is a gulag. There are serious human rights violations on a scale that shouldn't be tolerated in a country that's seen as a model country when it comes to human rights and women's rights, especially. So that's my long answer again to what do you say to people? People have often a totally wrong perception of how groups like that function, that people there who come across as shiny, happy people on TV or wherever, they're not. There's a front. They've been put in front of the camera. They've been hand-selected by the leaders to participate in a program like that. That is not the reality.
Well, like I said at the beginning, I think we have to do our own episode on both of those groups. But you went from Centrepoint, and then what was your next rabbit hole?
Next rabbit hole, big jump, but actually, again, lots of parallels, was Agama yoga in Thailand. It's still going as well. So it's a tantric yoga school. It's an offshoot of MISA, which is probably the worst sex trafficking yoga cult in the world at this stage. Their guru has been arrested in France last year, Gregorian Bivolaru. I hope we're going to hear more of them and from them in terms of their survivors speaking up. So that's the backdrop to Agama yoga, started by a Romanian who moved from India to Koh Phangan, a little hub of alternative healing and whatnot, like Bali. It's the place full of crystal shops and organic coffee, colonics, and
sounds like my kind of jam.
Sorry. I know, right? We could have a good holiday together.
I think we would.
I get that.
We'll find all the communities together.
That's true.
Yeah. You guys will be drinking green juice together, for sure.
Absolutely. Sorry, I derailed.
Anyway, it was actually the biggest yoga training center, as far as I know, in the world. So lots of international students there. They all came there for the yoga, right? And also maybe extra attraction, the Tantra or the Neo-Tantra, and that their gurus seemed, that they could get a bit of that into it. And then it was a tantric. I was actually, when I first heard about it, someone said, oh, I've lived in this tantric community. And that was the time when I was still quite fascinated and into the conscious sexuality scene and checked out some of these healers and went to a lot of workshops. And so I thought, oh, wow, there's actually a tantric community. And so years before I ever looked into Agama yoga as a journalist, because all these abuse allegations come up, I'd already heard about this place on an island somewhere in Thailand. I thought, interesting. So suddenly all this came together because Agama was blown out of the water by B. Schofield, an independent investigative cult journalist. And these 31 women from Agama had contacted her because they were just desperate to finally get the word out. They had 31 reports about sexual abuse, transgressions, including rape by the guru and by other lead teachers. And I mean, it's a long backstory, because over years and years and years, people at Garma had tried again and again to change the system from within. It's not like this was all suddenly new. It was known within Agama. It just came to a head. And it's such a symbolic story for me, because now I see other people trying to change groups from within, or, how can we reform a cult and all of that. Well, Agama, clearly it didn't happen. It didn't work. And people spent years and years and got sick over it and were, lost their income and their sanity and whatnot, trying to change that place, because they were so attached to the yoga and loved the teachings and had a community there and had maybe built their life on teaching there or living there for the last 10 years. So to actually face the hard realization, and their teacher is a rapist and their whole culture there is a rape culture, what to do. So it all blew up through B. Schofield, and then I decided to go there because I was on my annual trip back to Germany, and then together with a guardian, we had a bit of a joint joint venture. We blew it out of the water. I did a big report here for New Zealand and for Germany, where I work as a foreign correspondent for them, for German newspapers here from New Zealand as well, and the Guardian. And it was a massive, I think it was a big eruption in the yoga tantra world at the time, and someone coined the term, Me Too, and then coined the term Shri Too, because it happened in Sri Tanu. It was a bit of a turning point in terms of finally it's really on the record, or at least media is actually looking into this, because these allegations about tantric teachers, also from other schools and in the US and around the world. I mean, the talk and the smaller sort of reports and victim advocacy movements had been there before, but suddenly it was in the Guardian, right? And it was something to hold on to. But sad news is, even though there were reports in over 50 countries, media reports in over 50 countries, and it did put a big dent into the school's business, and the guru, the Swami, as he calls himself, fled the country, but came back conveniently after 3 months, when the statute of limitation for rape in Thailand at the time had just passed. Yeah, right.
Wow.
And so they're still going. And I've heard that they've really picked up business again through COVID with online courses and so on, because people don't Google, people forget.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they're so brainwashed into thinking that the media is evil, and they just want to get their tantric fix and their time on the island, like Sarah and I like to get it sometimes, somewhere in a place like that. Then they end up again in the school, and everything starts all over again. So that's really disheartening to see. So I went there in 2018. The Swami had just fled the island, but I talked to a lot of people there, went in there just for one day to a very eerie yoga class where I was the only student, and I really felt like the last passenger on the Titanic. I went to their kirtan, or as another word they use. Anyway, kirtan's not the right word, but chanting, but
satsang.
Yeah, not ceremonial singing in the evening, and everyone dressed in white, and it really felt like the orchestra was also still playing on that Titanic when I was there. Very, very a weird time of sort of watching a group like that, to actually be there at the time of after the eruption, after the destruction, the empire is falling, and you just, see everyone still holding it together inside, or the rats have left the sinking ship. So that was an interesting time. And then I revisited it all for my book, did a lot more research, also where people are at now, all these years later, heard some pretty horrific stories. Also from some people, and I think this is really quite meaningful, one man who was one of the accused, and he had actually really done work to redeem himself. And I'm really grateful that he gave me some insight into what made him that person who was then seen as an abuser. No, was an abuser to some degree, for sure. And what did he do to change that and to make amends? So that was also quite significant to me, to follow that process as well, of those who've been called out. And because they're all part of the same system, right? So it became a microcosm, again, like Centrepoint, where you have something that started as a wonderful thing, then goes really bad. What do the people do afterwards? How do they do the repair work? Who takes some ownership for the wrong that's happened? And who just tries and whitewashes it? And I tell you what, Agama has just been they have victim shamed and victim blamed and whitewashed themselves and rebranded themselves. So textbook example for that, and they're still going.
What are the parallels? Like, what language could you say that you notice, or what do you notice about all three that you didn't have an idea about before you started your inquiries?
Yeah, because there are so many parallels, right? They all look so different from the outside, these three groups that I mainly looked into. The parallels are the victim blaming, the spiritual bypassing. It's always on you. If something goes wrong, if you have a problem, if you suffer, if you're not happy here, if you think something's bad's happening to you, well, don't come to us and complain, but you work it out yourself. You need to work harder, you need to pray harder, you need to practice harder, whatever the modality in the group is, right? You've got to do more workshops if you're therapy, and maybe do more quote unquote sexual healing with Bert Potter, which often consisted of being drug raped because they manufactured psychedelics there that they then took in group sessions. Or you've got to just work hard on yourself and do more karma yoga if you're in a Agama. And at Gloriavale, you pray harder, you confess more, you do all the typical fundamentalist Christian things. So I think that is the common denominator in all those groups. And I see it perpetuated again and again when I look around me now in some of the operating New Age conscious sexuality groups also here in New Zealand and worldwide, where that's also baked into the tapestry. That's the common denominator. And the other common denominator, of course, just for those three, is the controlling of people's sex lives. And by control, amplifying can also be a form of control. So you would think something like a, free love commune, and I'm say this, with all the facetiousness in my my voice, in a Centrepoint, that there wouldn't be any control, but actually putting it on people that they have to be promiscuous is a form of creating a sexual dogma.
Sure.
And also at Agama, it was very much that you had to open up your relationship. The women who were polyamorous and the men were seen as the more evolved tantric lovers. There was this whole language around practicing tantra. It was supposed to be really detached. There was no encouragement of having romantic partners. It was all about practicing tantra and doing all this practice. So again, a very over-sexualized culture. And then you have Gloriavale, where this is all done basically in the marital bedroom. But in the early days, they also had these group sessions for couples where then, the leader would probably get off on watching watching his flock practicing their whatever marital activities or whatever, however they framed it. So again, the red thread through all these groups is also the control or amplification of sexuality.
Mm-hmm. I also really clearly saw that any stating of a boundary was an entry point for shame.
Oh, yes. And isn't that interesting, especially if you're in groups where there's now a lot of talk? I can see this, in the present a lot too, when you're in groups where there's a lot of focus actually on boundary work, or they practice the wheel of consent in the beginning or something. And so you're under this false impression of knowing how to set a boundary. Oh, we teach you how to say your yes and no in 2 hours. I've seen this at One Taste, for instance. I did the entry course. So they run you through a nice little exercise, which is totally, makes sense, of practicing your boundaries, practicing yes and no. Everyone should do it. This is not just about touch or orgasmic meditation or whatever. It's good for anything. But you don't it's not like you suddenly rewire yourself in 2 hours in a workshop after your whole life, especially as a woman and a nice person, and maybe in New Zealand where people tend to say, just be more maybe accommodating and polite. Yeah, you don't just learn how to rewire yourself. Yeah. And then, so there's almost that sort of fig leaf of, well, it's all on you now. You can give your consent. You've learned it. And then you're taken through these LGATs, large group awareness training. So again, this is, I think, true for a lot of different modalities and groups where you fill out forms beforehand. Are you aware of your boundaries? You know how you can do this and that, or they give you a little intro at the beginning. I mean, most groups these days call themselves trauma-informed to some degree, or everyone's heard about consent. You'd be really limping behind if you wouldn't introduce that at some stage early on, maybe even just for appearances and for legal reasons. So you tick those boxes. Oh yeah, trauma, consent, done. And then you're thrown into the cauldron with all the intensity, with a lot of content that no one told you about before that would happen. And it would be so confrontational, and so many people would be naked, and they'll be screaming and yelling and whatnot. You're totally out of your comfort zone. You're overwhelmed. You probably don't sleep enough. You never, you don't get time off. In some groups, you're absolutely shamed if at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, you want to actually head to bed and get some sleep. I've been there. I've seen that happening. Yep. But afterwards, if you're not happy and you're struggling, or the next morning or something comes up in the sharing circle where you honestly say, oh my God, this was too much for me. I really suffered. Or I couldn't stand seeing my partner getting close to someone else in that exercise. And it really brought up this and this, because you think this is an environment where you can now safely share, because everyone said this is all about openness and taking off your mask and being the real you. So you do that, and then boom, the suggestion or the feedback is, you're wrong. Right. This is not how we do it here. You just got to do more of what we're teaching you, and then you won't have those negative feelings about us or about yourself. So this is how it works.
And not only that, but the feedback quote from your book is a gift. Am I right?
Take it as a gift. Right. Well, Centrepoint was really, they had these little sayings. They had a thing, I think maybe it's from Gestalt therapy. I'm not 100% sure. But feedback, feedback's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for transparency and honesty. I come from Germany, where people are quite direct and in your face. And I had to really adjust in my 20 years here as a New Zealander now. I had to really adjust to saying things between the lines, not being so outspoken. But then the Centrepoint feedback was that you're entitled to just go up to anybody at any time and in their face just tell them what you think of them. And this also includes adults towards teenagers, for instance, who didn't have a choice to live there, who they weren't even matured yet. And they would hear all these things like, oh, this is how you come across. This is what I think about you. If you matured and bum, 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 they would be put in their place, or they would be hard hit with some pretty heavy verbal stuff. Now, there was no chance to go say, oh, what? And this is what I think about you. And this is how you pissed me off the last 3 weeks when you didn't do the dishes or whatever. No, you have to take it as a gift, right? And it's so toxic.
It's humiliating.
It's kind of like the therapy twist of spiritual bypassing, if that makes sense, that whatever happens, whatever you're not happy with is your fault to work through, right? It's a gift for growth. Right. The universe has provided you with something wonderful here to look at. Isn't that gold? Isn't it wonderful? Shouldn't we all be happy that we have this experience? Well, maybe you just book another course for another $2,000 and you can learn even more, right?
Oh, so convenient.
Yeah.
And now, a brief message from our Little Bit Culty sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to A Little Bit Culty, shall we?
In Nexium, we would say that, Nippy, about feedback.
All feedback's valid?
Yeah.
All feedback's valid. All feedback's valid. And if you got feedback that was totally not true and you were upset about it, then you need to look at that. Because why would you be upset about something that somebody thought about you if it wasn't true? That's a pride issue. That's an ego issue. So yeah, we had the same thing.
You totally had the crash course on that. And every time I've listened, to your episodes, I'm nodding thinking, wow, you really had it on steroids, this whole thinking, this whole philosophy. And at some degree, on some level, I guess, especially in the beginning, it can be very helpful or liberating. you think, well, actually, I can change.
Yeah, there's an initial hit.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. There are things that can really help me, especially if you come out of so much resentment. Look, I mean, let's face it, a lot of us go on those trainings. I've done something called life training. It's a bit landmarkish, but not quite as full on, but pretty much the same stuff over a weekend, more to life training. And of course, you always bring something with you, some resentment about your parents, or whatever it is. You come up with something. Otherwise you wouldn't be spending that money and go and spend a whole weekend with strangers, yelling on a stage or so. So then you get it's a total aha moment and a big relief if you then actually feel like, oh my God, something shifted. I don't have these awful feelings about my dad anymore. I don't have the hang up about this issue anymore. How fantastic. So it is great to see that there are tools where you can move things forward in your own psyche, in your emotions, in your life, maybe work them out with others. But if it becomes this prescriptive thing that you have to see everything through, it's almost like, when are the tools working for you, or when are you working for those tools, like you guys have for for an organization? When are you working for the system and the system's not helping you anymore? And that line gets blurred so quickly. And by the time you're kind of sabotaging yourself and what you would really need, it's often too late, because you're so sold, or you're hooked up, or you've signed up for the next thing. You have to make it work to justify the investment, right?
Right. Yeah, the sunk cost fallacy.
Yep.
Yeah.
And also, you're going up the path.
We have incentives.
Incentive. Like, I was shocked actually that Agama had a stripe path. They had the rainbows, the sashes.
Oh, gotcha. The sashes, everything.
Yeah, I found.
I wonder if there was a text thread with all these people.
Yeah, Keith is like, hey, Swami, what are you doing over there? And are you doing the sashes? Yeah, I'm going to do the sashes too. Okay, cool.
It's all the same.
Yeah, you must have. He's probably done some homework on some stuff. I think they've introduced another level from what I just when I wrapped up my book and I did my last sort of round of research around Agama. I heard that they've just introduced another level. Yeah, another level of sashes and bullshit. And again, it always pulls you further. I've heard this from the former students. There's always this carrot dangling in front of you, that there's a next level, and there's secrecy around that. This will all be revealed to you once you're ready for it. It will all be revealed, but you're not to know this yet, which creates these hierarchies. So again, looking at the common thread of these three groups, Centrepoint, Agama, Yoga, and Gloriavale, also these strong hierarchies. Centrepoint had something really insidious that I've seen replicated in smaller ways in some neo-tantra groups as well. Like, what are they called? TNT, the new tantra, one of the worst I've ever visited as a semi-professional sex cult tourist. So the hierarchy at Centrepoint was something they had actually brought over in the 80s from a similar group that was running in Austria at the time, Otto Mühl's Friedrichshof, which was a even more extreme sex cult, not sex and therapy, but sex and art, because their founder was this crazy artist who was the enfant terrible in Vienna at the time, and actually a lot of people still buy his pictures and think he's the real deal. And he set up this really extreme community. People all shaved their hair off, or wore this uniform dungarees. They had rosters every night, like who need to share the bed with whom, to prevent people from, actually becoming couples. It was just absolutely awful and abusive. Anyway, Centrepoint thought, oh, these are our friends over there, visited them in the 80s, came back with some wild idea that they also wanted to implement at Centrepoint, but only one of those ideas actually flew, and that was the hierarchy, where people, also children, youngsters, teenagers, were lined up every week and had to put themselves in the positions that they think where they should be basically in the hierarchy of the group, how they've performed, where they belong. So this very brutally Darwinistic approach, because that was, they tried to almost live like an old tribe in the in the days of the leader of the pack, and they wanted to experiment with these social dynamics of group living, but in the most radical way. So let's go back to the old tribes. Let's see what that's like. So they put people in these hierarchies, and that destroyed people. And I know that for a fact that some of the sexual abuse that happened to the children there and the young people, and a third of the children of Centrepoint actually were sexually abused. That was later established through a study. a lot of that also happened because of the hierarchy and because of the adults that were so dehumanized and broken that their resistance to speak up or to prevent some of that from happening or to protect their children was completely taken away. So I saw this replicated in a group, TNT, the New Tantra in Holland, and when I visited one of their courses in a smaller way, just got all my alarm bells ringing. I mean, the whole weekend was just one constant alarm bell. But at the end, the last day, they ranked everybody. You actually got it. There was a ranking in front of everybody, a public ranking. I don't know if you guys had that too with Nexium, where you were told in front of everyone whether you made the cut or not. They had a number, they had a grade for you, and you could just tell why certain people made the cut and others didn't. But then you could maybe do another course to catch up and then get in again. It was just awful. And I thought, here we go again. Have people learned nothing from these historical cults where something like a public ranking, a hierarchy, a humiliating process of public shaming and grading just creates so much toxicity in the group and conformity? Have they not learned anything? And no, they haven't.
Right.
It wasn't through the whole curriculum, but there was one training called 2A, Anatomy of Mind and Body, whatever F that means. But
I look back now.
Between every break, because we had, like, our structure was breakout groups, like 3 to 5, 6 people in a circle led by a coach discussing something. And before every group, we rated and ranked everyone in the group on top, like most to least, intelligent, sexy, honest. There were some other categories. Remember what they were? It was horrific. Intelligent. I did talk about this moment in my book because there was my boyfriend at the time rated Nicola, who I love now, he's one of my good friends, more attractive than me. And I was quite devastated at the time. But now we laugh. Nicola and I are still friends. But anyway, but it was horrific. It was actually really very challenging. We were in that training together, weren't we?
I don't know.
No, you were there.
Was I?
Yeah, I definitely rated Nippy most attractive, but in my head.
Just science. Just science.
Anyway.
But these hierarchies just come in so many forms, right? And at Gloriavale, you have really strong hierarchies in terms of the families that look down on other families. You have the leaders group. And then that also still carries on when people are on the outside, which I find quite interesting, that you can actually see how this little fiefdom, how these little animal farms that are created inside, there always hierarchy is a big part of it, and right. I mean not a healthy hierarchy, not one that's been earned or comes from it's actual
not a meritocracy.
Doing the real work and, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So where are we now?
Yeah. What have you gleaned from this whole ordeal of a journey?
And are you hopeful?
A lot of disillusionment, and part of me sometimes still wishes I had my innocence back and I could just go to some of these, and not necessarily courses, but maybe some of the festivals or so that I used to frequent more, or some workshops or some more sort of innocent, playful spaces. I've become very picky and very discerning, and even a humble meditation course, I can be critical if I think there's too much of this or too much of that. And so I've gleaned, again, I guess I've gleaned a lot of understanding of those dynamics. I mean, I'm obviously not an expert. I'm just someone who's come too close. So I'm even running little workshops here at festivals sometimes in New Zealand called How Not to Start a Cult, just to give some people some insight on the red flags. I've gleaned that knowledge, and it comes with grief and a sense of loss, and I can so relate to the cult hoppers. I can relate to people who've been in something far bigger than I have. I haven't even, I still wouldn't, it's still hard for me to even reframe my own experiences as cultic experiences because I wasn't harmed, or I'm not a survivor or a victim of those groups. And still, I have this, I get, a little glimpse of the grief, the loss, the confusion of, wow, I did move in a paradise, or kind of what I thought was a paradise at the time. I had entry to the Garden of Eden, and then I left it, and well, where to from here, right? So it took a long time even to just sort of be okay with just the mundane. But what I've gleaned is that we're all susceptible. What I've gleaned is that we could all be part of something that we didn't see coming, because we all have an Achilles heel where something can land. No one's immune. So I've really learned this. And I'm a shining example of that. I mean, I'm a journalist for starters. I've become a cult journalist, and still I went through a few things and they were really important in my life, and I was evangelical about them, that now I actually see as very culty. So does that, whatever I gleaned is, let's change the way how we report about cults. Let's make cult journalism a more important part of mainstream media, because it's still so fringe, it's still so niche. Usually what we see, I mean, it's changed, and also thanks to you guys, a lot has changed over the last 10 years. I have to say the quality of documentaries, the quality of reporting has changed. Me Too has changed that. But here in New Zealand, again and again, because behind the scenes is someone who is often a liaison between survivors and victims, and then journalists who I trust, and I put someone into their hands just because I can't do all these investigations anymore. I also see how little actually comes out, and how it's strained, just often because the resources aren't there, because the litigation risk is too high. And that's a problem, because we need better reporting about these things. We need better understanding. We need more cult education in general.
The journalists too.
Journalists need more cult education.
Yeah.
The judiciary needs more cult education.
Totally
Police
agree.
needs more cult education. And you know what? This is actually, this is my latest thing. I'm actually organizing the first cult awareness conference here in New Zealand called DECULT, and we're bringing cult experts like Jan Jelalich
That's awesome.
and Jimmy Jenkinson over to actually introduce cult recovery therapy, and also to invite government officials and the police and others to come and actually get some cult education. Because going back to Gloriavale, there have been court cases a few years ago where clearly justice wasn't done. It was maybe even a miscarriage of justice, where things were so delayed because the judiciary did not understand how a young woman from Gloriavale reacts in court, and is not the same as another woman who's been brought up in middle New Zealand, not in a cult like Gloriavale. So this is so lacking, and it actually leads to, it can distort the course of justice. It has so many ripple effects to. Anyway, I could go on and on, but anyway, this is what I've also learned is we need to do something about this. So hey, let's have a cult conference in New Zealand, bring some people here, internationals. Let's talk about this and hopefully raise awareness.
Where can people find out about DECULT? Great title, by the way.
It's a new verb.
Great.
They can find us on decult.net. And they can find all the info and ticket registration, everything there. It's going to be live streamed around the world, and I hope you guys will watch it.
For sure.
Absolutely. And people can find your book wherever books are sold. It's on Audible. I listened to it, even though you sent it to me, as our audience knows.
Read it.
I like to listen.
I like to hold it.
And together we have perfect experience. So one of the main takeaways I had from reading your book is just how hard it is, if it maybe even impossible, to have consent in a hierarchy in this way, where, specifically there's a power differential, and it's not an earned hierarchy, and perhaps even the person at the top has not the best interests of the lower members of the hierarchy in mind. So what is the antidote to being somebody who wants to explore their sexuality in this way?
Well, just back to the hierarchy and what you just said in the first part of the question. The hierarchy isn't always so obvious. It's not always as obvious as it is in, let's say, Agama yoga, where you have all the ranks and the sashes. If you go into an environment where they tell you we're all adults here, we're all consenting adults here, but the power differential isn't named, that you are still a paying participant, and the other person there in the sexy embrace with you or eye gazing with you is the teacher, or is an assistant, at least, or facilitator. And then they say things like, oh, the field is open, which means you are now invited or encouraged, empowered, whatever you want to call it, to maybe engage in some erotic way with someone, or practice some conscious touch exercises, however far you want to go, including the facilitators. And in their books, or how they justified, they're not approaching you. It's coming from you. So if you want to have an experience with them, also outside of the course room, maybe later on. But you chose this. They're just here to provide, right? And give you some of their maybe, amazing healing.
/ magic penis. Yep. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, the magic wand, right? Doing the rounds. And I've seen it. It's like a harem culture, and women basically lining up outside the bedroom of the main dude, and still believing, oh, we're all equals here. Well, they're not.
Right.
They're, in effect, the fact that one of them promotes, the teacher facilitator promotes himself as a sex god, has been in the media, in a documentary where he's claimed he slept with 2,000 women. Of course, for a lot of women, that brings up, wow, there must be something that I haven't had in my life yet. I want a bit of that. So it creates that whole dynamic of, ooh, there's something to get. So they're almost competing for a spot in his, a place in his bed. The same in Centrepoint. Women were lining up outside of Bert Potter's hut when his wife was out for work. By no ways was he a sex god. Yeah, he really looked like an older potato farmer.
Yeah, he did.
And apparently he wasn't even a great lover from what I've heard. But it's this whole thing of, oh, I'm actually being seen by the guru. I'm actually engaging with someone who's more advanced than me, and there will be some quote unquote transmission of a kind that I can only get through having sex with him. And you can probably fool yourself into that, even if the physical interaction is no different. I mean, really, there's probably only so much you can do differently in that department from what other people do as well in the bedroom. But you can heighten this experience for yourself because you're projecting so much on this other person, and becomes this whole outwardly experience, or often not, because I've also heard that it's not always that great, and women that actually leave feeling completely deflated, like, oh, that was all. But because there's this expectation that you're not changed and healed and you've been with the guru, you're still supposed to play along with, oh yeah, wow, I've been initiated. It's different now. So to answer your question, what's the antidote? Look, talking more about this in general, about our sexual desires, about our hang-ups, about our needs, about our shame, about our issues, and not just leaving that to, in the sort of the dark corners. I spent 2 very formative years in the US, in Los Angeles, as a young journalist. And coming from Germany, where we have a bit of a different culture, at least I grew up in the 70s with libertarian parents, and Germans are quite known for, going to the beach naked and sitting in the sauna, not in a sexualized way, but then being confronted almost with American culture around sexuality, where I thought either everything was so pornographic and over-amplified, or it was shut down and shamed, and there wasn't much in between, which I think is symbolic for the whole problem we're facing.
Totally.
So if we had a healthier culture in how we bring up our kids, how we look at our bodies, how we accept our, gender fluidity, whatever it is, just a bit, you name it. If we were a bit more conscious, God, I hate this word these days, but if we could implement, right, it's so tainted, right? But if we had a more open, healthier, honest way of addressing this important part of our lives, which everyone is doing or thinking about or consumed by or put off by or harmed by or is monetizing it, if we manage to somehow handle our sexual culture better, I think there would be less of a place for these groups who offer something or seem to offer something and promise some kind of healing or the answer, and then they can just run wild with it, and there's no accountability, and they don't come under scrutiny because no one wants to talk about having been to these groups and getting their fix there. That's part of the problem.
That is such a great answer, and I hope that this podcast can be the beginning of it, this particular episode and future episodes on all of those sex cults out there. Gosh.
I know. Who knew?
I just had this sort of, every now and then I flash back to us in NXIVM and imagining if I could tell that person what we'd be doing now.
Also, we weren't the only one. That's what's so amazing about this whole thing is there's so many more out there. It's just crazy.
And truly, your book really does such a great job of the interviews and shining so much light.
It's really well done.
Really well done, and major trigger warning to our audience. There's some very, very upsetting stories that you share, especially with children. But I also I think it's important that people know what happened and that these victims get justice and that they can heal. So thank you for being a responsible journalist and for being also so vulnerable with your journey. I think that's what's really unique about you, is that you're not a outsider, voyeuristic, judgmental journalist. You're in the thick of it.
Not judgmental is the best.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed reading your journey, and I know our audience will just love it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Nippy, for taking the time and also really going into it all with me and getting where I was at. It means a lot. Thank you.
Of course. Please keep in touch. You have an ally in us, as always. You like what you hear? Please do give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know what to do. Thank you for listening, everybody. We will be posting on Instagram soon. Keep an eye out for some breaking news about a new format for our Patreon. Coming soon, you'll be able to access all of our bonus episodes. That's all for every month for just $5 a month. Thank you, everyone who's been supporting us already. If you enjoyed Anke's book or this episode, please also check out her symposium coming up in New Zealand, DECULT. You can check that out on her website in our show notes. Especially if you're in New Zealand or Australia, that should be an easy trip for you. Hope you can make it. Thanks, everyone, and see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/alittlebitculty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out alittlebitculty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain / bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. And our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.